Some critics of the late Pope Francis have been saying that the Church should strive to eliminate tensions, namely by picking one side over the other. Now, what do they mean by that? And why should we not do that? Hello, everyone, and welcome back. Very recently, Father Gerald Murray, best well known for his participation in the so-called papal posse during Pope Francis' pontificate, wrote an article called The Jargon-Filled Synodal Trajectory. Now, his article rests on the very common presupposition that synodality is all about meaningless gibberish that no one can really understand. Now, I have already debunked that myth in my earlier video on synodality, so please check that out if you haven't already. But in this article, Father Murray raises an objection that is relatively common, and so I would like to address it in this video. Namely, he takes issue with a quote from Sister Natalie Beckart, the Undersecretary of the Synod Secretariat, where she says, "The dynamism that animates the final document, and which the implementation phase is called to take on, derives from the continuous articulation of certain polarities and tensions that structure the life of the Church and the way in which ecclesiological categories express it. Implementation of the final document requires addressing and discerning these tensions as they arise in the circumstances in which each local church exists. The path to advance is not to seek an impossible arrangement that eliminates tension in favor of one of the sides. Rather, in the here and now of each local church, it will be necessary to discern which of the possible balances allows for a more dynamic service of the mission." Father Murray then goes on to argue that, according to her logic, the Council of Nicaea, the first ecumenical council, would not pass the so-called test of synodality because it sought to eliminate tensions by picking one side over the other, namely by affirming orthodoxy and anathematizing heterodoxy or heresy. But here's the thing. Sister Beckart never mentions the tension between orthodoxy and heterodoxy. No, rather, she brings up many other tensions, like the tension between the universal church and the local churches, the tension between the participation of all and the authority of some, the tension between the common priesthood and the ministerial priesthood, but not the tension between orthodoxy and heterodoxy. It is Father Murray himself who brings up the tension between orthodoxy and heterodoxy, and by doing so, he actually undermines his own argument. Why? Because I argue that not only would the Council of Nicaea pass this test, the Council of Nicaea would actually be a prime example of the church balancing tensions. And it did so precisely because it chose orthodoxy. How is this? Because, as Father Murray said, the Council of Nicaea chose orthodoxy, and orthodoxy is by definition about balancing tensions, whereas heterodoxy or heresy is about eliminating those tensions. So let's rewind a bit and see what the Council of Nicaea was all about. This council was dealing with the teachings of Arius, who was proposing that the Son, the second person of the Trinity, could not be co-eternal with the Father. So the Father would have created the Son. The Son would be a creature. Now, the Council of Nicaea rejected this and advanced in opposition the Orthodox opinion, which is that Father and Son are co-eternal because they are consubstantial. It's in our creed. And this was the first step into the full definition of the doctrine of the Holy Trinity. But here's the twist. This definition from the Council of Nicaea actually raised more questions than it answered, and Arius could easily object that, oh, if you're saying that the Father and the Son are co-eternal, then you're saying that there are actually two gods, not just one, and so you're not being a monotheist. And how did Orthodoxy answer? By saying, yes, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit are co-eternal, and there are not three gods but just one. Confusing? Definitely. At least it was very confusing for Arius. But Orthodoxy demands that we hold both statements at the same time. So we need to balance this tension between there's only one God and there are three co-eternal persons. Arius could not live with this tension, so he just dropped the three co-eternal persons to hold on to the proposition there's only one God. Today, we've grown so used to this doctrine of the Holy Trinity, we don't even give it too much thought. We just recite it and accept it as fact. But if you think a little, the tension is still there. For example, what does it mean when Jesus, the Son, the second person of the Trinity, was praying in Gethsemane, asking God the Father so that the cup of his crucifixion would pass? Or what does it mean when Jesus says that about the end of the world, only the Father knows the time and the place, not even the Son? Still, the Church maintains that Jesus Christ is at the same time fully human and fully divine. It was the heretics of the past who could not live with this tension, so the Arians and later the Nestorians would just cut off Jesus' divinity to lean more heavily into his humanity, whereas other heretics like the monophysites and the monothelites would cut the tension all the same, but to lean more on Jesus' divinity to the detriment of his humanity. Orthodoxy keeps both. Jesus is fully human and fully divine. It keeps the tension alive. And this leads us to another interesting phenomena. Now, if there is a tension, that means there are two poles pulling against each other. And so orthodoxy keeps this tension alive by respecting both poles. Whereas heterodoxy cuts the tension by choosing one pole over the other. But since there are two poles pulling against each other, that means that heterodoxy can manifest itself in two forms depending on which pole remains dominant. In short, heresies often come in pairs. Orthodoxy, contrary to what Father Murray has been proposing, does not sit on one end, on one extreme, fighting against heterodoxy on the other extreme. Rather, orthodoxy sits in the middle, balancing the tension between two extremes, and it's the heterodoxies or heresies that sit on either side of those extremes. And another important thing to consider is that since both extremes are so radical, they tend to see orthodoxy in the middle as siding with the other extreme. So for an Arian, orthodoxy might seem monophysite. For a monophysite, orthodoxy might seem Arian, but orthodoxy is neither Arian nor monophysite, it is just orthodoxy. And this is important to understand the mindset behind Father Murray's article, because people who share from his leanings tend to see orthodoxy on one end fighting against heterodoxy on the other, and then they identify heterodoxy with liberalism or progressivism. So they believe that as long as they are opposing the liberals or the progressives, that they are being orthodox. And that's why they oppose synodality and Pope Francis, because they lump synodality and Pope Francis with the liberals. So for them, synodality and Pope Francis must be heterodox, and the orthodox that they are must oppose that. But as I said, orthodoxy is not that. It's about balancing the tension between two extremes. And if one extreme is liberalism or progressivism, then the other extreme must be radical traditionalism or radical conservatism. And just like the liberals might think that orthodoxy is too conservative or too traditionalist, for the radical traditionalists or radical conservatives, orthodoxy seems too liberal. So if you fight liberalism and progressivism so hard that you end up rejecting the living magisterium, you are not being orthodox, you have just fallen into the other heterodox end. So, some people will see a tension between Pope Francis and his predecessors, or between Amoris Laetitia and, let's say, Veritatis Splendor, or, let's say, between the pre Vatican II Church and the post Vatican II Church. And these people will feel the tension and try to solve it by cutting it. So liberals will just unapologetically choose Pope Francis and Amoris Laetitia or the post Vatican II Church. But here's the twist. Radical traditionalists will do the exact same thing, but just choose the other pole. Cut the tension and then choose John Paul II or Veritatis Splendor or the pre Vatican II Church. Different poles, but the same mindset. Orthodoxy doesn't do that. It doesn't cut the tension, it keeps it alive. It's not Pope Francis or John Paul II, it's both. It's not Amoris Laetitia or Veritatis Splendor, it's both. It's not the pre Vatican II Church and the post Vatican II Church, it's both. This is the reason why Benedict XVI warned against a hermeneutic of rupture and called instead for a hermeneutic of continuity. Rupture implies that the tension has snapped, whereas continuity means that there is a tension that remains intact. Now, some people might object to what I'm saying and push back by saying, but Pedro, are you saying that we must believe two contradictory things? Well, that's against both church teaching and reason. But that's not what is going on here. There cannot be a tension between two contradictory statements because they cannot live side by side. If one is true, the other is false, is one or the other. There cannot be a tension between them. A tension can only exist between two statements that are not contradictory but seem so, although they can be eventually reconciled. Back to the Council of Nicaea. Arius would certainly argue that there is a contradiction between the statements there is only one God and Father and Son are co eternal. But these are not contradictory. The contradiction with the statement the Father and Son are co eternal is Father and Son are not co eternal. And the contradiction with the statement there is only one God is there isn't only one God. But the statements, there is only one God, and the Father and the Son are co-eternal, are not contradictory among themselves. They only seem difficult to reconcile. And to reconcile them is exactly what orthodoxy demands us to do. But we can only do so by keeping the tension alive. Now, Father Murray would probably wave away this exercise as Hegelianism. Now, Hegel was a German philosopher that the critics of Pope Francis often bring up as an example of heterodoxy. As Father Murray says in his article, this is pure Hegelianism. Step 1: thesis meets antithesis, resulting in a synthesis. Step 2: repeat step 1 ad infinitum. The Church in the scheme does not teach dogmatic truth, but rather ponders different approaches that need to be balanced one against the other. Then Father Murray asks rhetorically, when has the Church ever taught this? And I answer, with Thomism. You see, Hegel was not the only philosopher who used this pattern of thesis, antithesis, and synthesis, what we call dialectics. St. Thomas Aquinas and the medieval scholastics also used that a lot because if you read them, you see that they often structured their approaches to complex and nuanced questions with "it seems like" thesis. On the contrary, antithesis, I argue that synthesis. As Jorge Bergoglio said before being elected Pope Francis, we must strip the term dialectic of every Hegelian resonance. In other words, dialectics does not imply Hegelianism. There are ways, Catholic, traditional ways to use dialectics. And this brings us to why I think that this video was so important, because it cuts to the core of an essential part of Pope Francis's thought and theology, namely that he used to approach complex theological issues by using the concept of opposizione polare, the opposition of poles. And he did not invent this, he got this from very important and orthodox theologians that formed this thought throughout his ecclesiastical career, namely Romano Guardini. But unfortunately, many of his critics are not acquainted with this concept of opposizione polare, at least not in the Anglo-Saxon world, so they got confused whenever Pope Francis used it. But right off the bat, in Evangelii Gaudium, Pope Francis's first and programmatic papal document, he explains, this requires acknowledging a principle indispensable to the building of friendship in society, namely that unity is greater than conflict. Solidarity, in its deepest and most challenging sense, thus becomes a way of making history in a life setting where conflicts, tensions, and oppositions can achieve a diversified and life-giving unity. This is not to opt for a kind of syncretism or for the absorption of one into the other, but rather for a resolution which takes place on a higher plane and preserves what is valid and useful on both sides. And on his letter to the people of God on pilgrimage in Germany, which was written precisely to counteract the German church's push towards misusing synodality for a liberal or progressive agenda, Pope Francis writes, what's at the root of this temptation is to think that, given so many problems and deficiencies, the best answer would be to reorganize things, make changes and especially patches that would order and synchronize the life of the church by adapting it to the logic of a particular group. Through this path, it would seem that everything would be solved if the ecclesial life would acquire a predetermined order, new or old, that would end the tensions proper to our being human, and even those that the gospel seeks to provoke. This path would eliminate tensions by being in order and line, but with time it would only put to sleep and domesticate our people's hearts, and weaken the vital and evangelic strength that the Spirit wants to give us. Today, we are called to gestate imbalance. We cannot do something good and evangelical if we are afraid of imbalance. We cannot forget that there are tensions and imbalances that have the flavor of the gospel. And if you ask me, there is no tension with a greater flavor of the gospel than the crucifixion. Just picture this. Jesus is being nailed to two sides of the cross, his arms stretched wide and in tension. And for us, this crucifixion is a scandal. That's why the thief says to Jesus, "Why don't you go out of the cross?" Because it's the very human response to it. Because every fiber of our being, when we are in tension, demands relief. A crucified person held in so much tension that the muscles and sinew are almost at a breaking point tries to find relief by at least releasing one arm. If one arm had been released, then the person would already feel some relief. But that's not what Jesus sought. He kept the tension because he needed to be crucified because it was his Father's will for the good of mankind. And therefore, if we are to be disciples of Christ, we are called to also keep the tension of the cross alive. One final caveat. There is a difference between opposizione polare, between polar opposition and polarization. And that's going to be the topic of my next video. In the meantime, if you want to know more about Pope Francis's theology of polar opposition, or about the theologians that formed this thought on this matter, or on how this is perfectly reconcilable with tradition, please check out my book, Heresy Disguised as Tradition. Chapter 4 deals entirely with the topic of this video. I will leave a link in the description below to where you can buy this book, as well as links to Pope Francis' interventions that I mentioned throughout this video. If you want to know more about this book and others, please visit my website, pedrogabrielwriter.com. Also, if you found this video helpful, please like and subscribe so that you'll be updated whenever a new video is released. That's all for today. God bless, keep the tension alive, and see you soon.